Independent inquiry into child sexual abuse has published its findings with regard to Westminster specifically, and it has found that political institutions have significantly failed in their responses to allegations of child sexual abuse for decades. The report concludes that these are another one here. A former MP for South Dorset and the 10th Earl of Sandwich was let off with a caution after a 10-year-old boy alleged he had indecently assaulted him. Montague's own son, who he also sexually abused for over 5 years, said the decision not to prosecute was entirely wrong and very indicative of the attitude towards people in public positions. And that seems to me to be the point. I'd go further, actually, and say it's not just people in public positions. The victims of so-called grooming gangs were similarly ignored and sidelined and demonised in many cases. White working-class girls abused by men who were largely brown, of course. Some people think that that is a crucial element of the story, so I'm happy to acknowledge that it's true that they were mostly white and the abusers were mostly brown, but quite how you think that matters when you're reading a story like this one, I will never understand. Of course I understand, but I'll never understand how people can care more about the colour of a criminal than the crimes committed. And yet here we are. It really pains me to remind you what our Prime Minister said about this inquiry not long ago in this very room. In fact, you may have forgotten, or you may not have registered at the time, just how despicable his contribution to this conversation was. I will remind you of it shortly. I'll also remind you of a clip we played many, many times, going right back to 2013-14, I think, of a former member of Ted Heath's whip's office, describing precisely what this report has now confirmed. And I wonder whether now is a moment to ask whether not being believed is almost as bad as being abused in the first place. And we're not learning. I'm sorry to tell you this. I'm so sorry to tell you this. We're not learning any lessons from this at all. Even today, I was looking at a story that described how people would get help if they found themselves unable to stop watching child porn. Still, national newspaper headline containing the phrase child porn, which makes it just sound like the sort of underage equivalent of adult porn, when of course child porn is a phrase that we should have excised from our collective vocabulary years ago. Images of children being abused and, this comes with a trigger warning, images of children being abused and raped. That's what gets filed under child porn, and you have to ask yourself why. You have to ask yourself why. What do you want to hear first, the current Prime Minister or the former member of the Whip's office? I shall let you decide. I don't know what question to ask you, and I don't feel minded to talk about anything else on this programme today until 1 o'clock, but I am drawn to the pain of not being believed. The pain of not being believed. If you would like to talk about that today, then I don't understand why some people have been very keen to dissuade me from returning to these subjects. Some people whose motivations are deeply, deeply questionable, somehow trying to hang the hoaxer Carl Beach round my own neck. I know why. It's not hard to work out. Here's Boris Johnson.
One comment I would make is I think an awful lot of money, an awful lot of police time now goes into these historic offences and all this malarkey, and £60 million I saw was being spaffed up the wall on some investigation into historic child abuse and all this kind of thing. Well, what on earth is that going to do to protect the public now?
I'm tempted to just play that out on loop until Sheila Fogarty gets here, but I'm not going to, because I want at least to remind you of what this former member of Ted Heath's Whip's office said on the record to the BBC before his death.
Anyone with any sense who was in trouble would come to the Whips and tell them the truth and say, no, I'm in a jam, can you help? It might be debt, it might be scandal involving small boys, or any kind of scandal. If we can get a chap out of trouble, then he'll do as we ask forevermore.
Tim Fortescue, Whip under Heath, on film saying that he would fix or cover up any MP's problems. And to be fair to Mr. Fortescue, who, as I said, is no longer with us, that I don't think was exceptional at the time, and in many, many circles. They must have known at my schools what was going on. The teachers, this is the great legacy of child sexual abuse. And, you know, a monk from my school was jailed only 2 weeks ago. Another one, not one I had anything to do with, but some of my friends did. And the hardest thing for those of us, and I use the word advisedly, lucky enough not to have been touched by these perverts, the hardest thing for us is the knowledge of what was happening to our friends, but also, of course, the suspicion that the teachers we did like and the teachers who haven't been subsequently exposed as disgusting and despicable, if we knew what was going on, if the kids knew, if the lads knew, surely the teachers knew. Surely the teachers knew. And what these stories remind us of is that when children come forward, or of course former children, now adults come forward with allegations, there is an atmosphere of scepticism that I will never understand. Even if, I mean, this is trickier, of course, to process intellectually, but if you caught one, if you investigated 100 and 99 were found out to be innocent, but you caught one, it's very easy, I suppose, for us to say it would still have been worth it. But if you'd been one of the 99, then you probably, I don't know, would you feel differently? I don't know. 24 minutes after 12 is the time. So I'm going to ask you a very sensitive question, and I hope a respectful one. If you would like to contribute to this conversation in any way, then you're warmly welcomed to do so. I appreciate, and I remind you, for people affected by these issues, that there could well be triggers coming up. But I think it's important to remember, and that contribution, that comment from Tim Fortescue really brings this into sharp focus, is that it was not a crime that was viewed as vilely then as it is today. Now, by that, I'm not excusing or explaining. Crikey, if anybody in this industry doesn't need to explain their absolute revulsion at these sort of crimes, it's me. But when you were at school, I bet you that teachers had nicknames based upon their propensity for being a bit gropey or a bit grabby. I bet you, when you were at school, or when you were an altar boy, or when you were going to scouts, or when you were involved in sports coaching, football, whatever it may be, I bet you that there were rumours about adults. And I bet you that other adults told you to shut up and move on. One of the most harrowing calls we ever took was from a young woman who told us that her parish priest was abusing her in Ireland in the 1970s, and her own mother hit her for telling her. That's the real story here, is people who have not been believed. And it is, and I won't mention this again because it's not really relevant today, but it is why some people are so desperate to focus attention on men who turned out to have been lying as a way of distracting all of us from the children that have been telling the truth all along, whether in Rochdale as victims of grooming gangs, or whether in Westminster as victims of people like Cyril Smith. Former Liberal Party leader Lord Steele said that because allegations against Smith had arisen before he joined the party, he saw no reason or no locus to go back to it. This failure to recognise the risks was an abdication of responsibility, and the fact that the offences were non-recent was irrelevant. Now, I can't quite get my head around that comment from Boris Johnson. I couldn't at the time, and I still can't now. But I do know that if you were raised in that milieu, there was a tendency or a temptation to see child sexual abuse as somehow harmless. There were nicknames for teachers who... I look back at Ampleforth. There was one teacher in particular who... I don't think he would have abused a boy in a million years, but the way he spoke and his inappropriate sort of campish conduct was comedic to us as kids. And yet, his nickname was Dirty. See, the nicknames are there. But I don't think he was an abuser. I'm certainly not aware of anyone having come forward. The abusers turned out to be the monks often, and occasionally the lay staff, who had reputations among the rest of us for being quite caring and quite decent. Which means, of course, when someone plucked up the courage to come forward and say, I've been abused by father, whoever, they closed ranks. They closed ranks. They closed ranks. How can you close ranks? Answer, easy. You don't think it's that big a deal. How can you not think it's that big a deal? Answer, damned if I know. Damned if I know. You got that alt-right geezer with the Greek name coming out, of course, didn't you, not long ago, talking about how he thinks it's perfectly acceptable for grown men to have sexual relations with teenage boys. Absolute silence from people who collaborated with him or championed him. I feel very sorry for him, because that's what we all do sometimes. If bad things have happened to us, we persuade ourselves that they weren't bad at all. That's part of the process here. Part of the process here. But the big issue, the big scandal, is the treatment of the people who've come forward. Whether they were making allegations against Sir Cyril Smith or Sir Peter Morrison or Sir Peter Hayman or anybody else. We didn't look after them. And that's why of all Boris Johnson's myriad flaws and failings, of all his offences against common decency, I will never, I don't think, be persuaded that this is not by far the most despicable.
One comment I would make is I think an awful lot of money, an awful lot of police time now goes into these historic offences and all this malarkey, and, £60 million I saw was being spaffed up the wall on, some investigation into historic child abuse and all this kind of thing. I mean, what on earth is that going to do to protect the public now?
Malarkey. Spaffed up the wall. No wonder he spent half his life hiding in a fridge.